Okay. We talked about this. I got a little ahead of our slides. Talk about the participation requirements. In addition to their notice rights, the public also has certain access and participation rights. First, the meeting has to be open. The public has to be capable of attending. There can't be really any conditions on attendance. You can't require the public to sign in or to pay to participate. Certainly there can be security measures and there could be a voluntary sign-in, things like that, but there can't be actual restraints and conditions on the public's ability to participate. If you have a meeting that's happening by teleconference or some other means of technology, interestingly, the Act requires that each location where the meeting stems from has to be open to the public. So you can't really, as a practical matter, have a meeting where a member of the body is participating, say, from home, unless that home is open to the public and the public has an ability to speak and participate from that home and it's ADA compliant, et cetera. In addition to being able to attend, the public has a right to address the state agency directly, either before or during its discussion on the items identified in the notice. There can be some reasonable constraints around the public's ability to comment, and usually you'll see these as you may need time limits. And as long as those are reasonable, those are permissible. Just very briefly, because we're running short on time, some final rights of the public are that there can't be any, voting has to be open, there can be no secret ballot, and the public has a right to record or broadcast the meeting in general with some few exceptions. Let me talk very briefly about the penalties and remedies, and then we'll move on to the Public Records Act. What happens if we don't comply with Baggley-Keene? It can be complicated. First, the decision of the body can be overturned. So in some cases, that might not be the worst hurdle in the world, but in other cases, you can imagine it may be very difficult to unwind a decision and start over, to sort of put the toothpaste back in the tube, and it may create a practical problem for that body that can be very, very complicated if that decision gets negated. There's also the potential for injunctive relief, and this is something to be very aware of. So injunctive relief can mean not only that violations might be stopped or prevented in the future, but it also can invite investigation or inquiry into how that body or how that state agency handles Baggley-Keene matters generally. In certain situations, there can be criminal misdemeanor penalties. If the individual intends to deprive the public of information that the individual knows or should know that the public has a right to, then there is the potential of criminal penalties. Lastly, I want to point out that there's an opportunity, if a cause of action is brought against the state agency for failure to comply with Baggley-Keene, there is an opportunity to cure that at the outset, during the litigation before it's resolved. But again, not all Baggley-Keene violations are really going to be capable of being cured as a practical matter. So it may be unrealistic to put everybody back at square one and unwind that process. Question?
So if you're in the middle of, let's say, a social gathering that somehow turns into a discussion that would constitute a meeting, what is your affirmative obligation? Obviously, would be to stop whatever that conversation is, but do you have to report it, or is there any other obligations that, as an individual or as a body, that we would have?
That's a good question. I don't think that there's not a Baggley-Keene reporting requirement, but perhaps the question really goes to, what is a best practice? And I think it would depend on the nature of the conversation. If a conversation really spins out of control and you leave that conversation feeling that a quorum of a body had a meeting, then I think you would want to engage those folks in the organization that can help figure out the best strategy to mitigate it. It may not be possible to actually resolve it entirely or unwind it entirely, but there may be things you can do to mitigate it. Certainly if it starts a discussion process, you can always then give the public the opportunity to participate, a good, fair, full opportunity to participate in that discussion. And that may not, in all cases, completely resolve it, but it certainly could mitigate it. And if that body were to reach out, say, to council, there's other mitigating factors that could be taken at that point.
Okay, thanks.
But I think the important part that you said is that the part that the member of the body can do is stop, let it not continue, cut off the communication or not let the communication go to that next level where it might result in a serial meeting. We did hand out some hypotheticals, but I think we've really covered the substance of those, so I'm going to suggest that we skip them and we save enough time to discuss the PRA. But if there are more questions on Baggley-Keene at this point, we can take those before we begin to talk about the Public Records Act. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Scott Yates.